This video is from the Epiphany Autism blog, which you can find just by Googling Epiphany ASD. The subject of the video is version 6 of the Polypill for Severe Autism. Because many people coming to the blog are not regular readers, I do include quite a lot of background information before getting into the detail of the current version of the Polypill. Since not everyone is a regular to the blog, it's important to define what I mean by severe autism. I'm talking about classic autism, otherwise known as Kaner's autism or autistic disorder. So this is, if you like, full-blown autism. Now, this kind of autism will contain most of the elements on this pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have just impaired social and communication skills. That alone these days will get you a diagnosis of autism, but really that's Asperger's syndrome. There are very many other elements involved in classic autism: sensory issues, anxiety, speech disorder ranging from entirely non-verbal to partially verbal, cognitive dysfunction, fine gross motor skill issues, aggression and self-injury, and finally epilepsy. This is all part and parcel of autism. The more severe the autism, the more elements of this pyramid will be present. The meaning of the word autism has morphed in the last 20 years. So prior to the year 2000, if you had a diagnosis of autism, this was a severe disability. If you get diagnosed these days with autism, it can be something relatively trivial, and it won't really affect the trajectory of your child's life. But this presentation, my blog, is about severe autism. This is the autism of the year 2000 and before. So I always have to now add the word severe, otherwise people don't know what sort of autism I'm talking about. This sort of autism, call it severe autism, classic autism, it should be treated medically because it's a medical disorder. But you have to use a highly personalized approach, because within this observational diagnosis of autism are hundreds of different possible dysfunctions. So it's highly complicated. What's interesting is that these drugs that are effective in treating severe autism can also be used in Asperger's, and some of them are effective. So it's really a question of whether those people wish to be treated or not. An important point is why treat autism. Now, to understand that, you really have to consider what the outcome is likely to be. And this is something that no one's going to tell you when your child is diagnosed age 3 with autism. But in reality, the outcome varies from poor to very poor. Children diagnosed very young with autism will inevitably have a severe variant. So if you're diagnosed age 3, it's likely to be severe autism. There are some long-term studies that have been completed looking at the outcome over a 20-year period. In the US, it was Catherine Lord who did these studies, and what she did was she split her group into the weaker 60% and the more successful 40%. So the weaker 60%, age 19, had an IQ on average less than 20. Now the average IQ is 100, and an IQ less than 70 would count as mental retardation, intellectual disability. But not just did they have low IQ age 19, they had living skills of a 4-year-old. Now the top group, the top 40%, they actually ended up with a normal IQ, so average should have been 100 at age 19. But they still only had living skills of a 7-year-old. Now that has profound implications for whether or not those people can live independently. A very similar study was carried out in France, and the results are similar. The difference is that in France, autism always meant something more severe than it did in the US, so their group of low performers, if you like, accounts for 80% of the group, and the high growth top performers is just 20%. And the low growth group are similarly with daily living skills of about 36 months, so a 3-year-old at the age of 21. The top performers, which is just 20% of the group, do much better, and they end up with daily living skills of someone with age of 180 months, so that's a 15-year-old. So now you know that the prognosis in the case of classic autism is not good at all. So what do you do about it? Well, my suggestion is that you devote your brain power and your ingenuity, which is perhaps more important, and do something about it. There's no shortage of information, scientific information out there. My own blog has got 500 posts, and in many of the posts there's at least 10 scientific papers that are reviewed. And then do the best you can for the well-being of your child. Now, in the ideal world, you just go to an autism doctor and everything will be done within a month or two. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Having said that, there are some doctors out there who are able to help you. So my suggestion is to get in touch with one of those. This is a graphical simplification of what is autism. I constructed this Venn diagram a few years ago and it still seems to apply, so I've included it in this presentation today. There are 4 elements. The first element, the blue element, is the channelopathies and differentially expressed genes. This itself is a complex subject. The red part, neuroinflammation, that's simpler to understand. Then we have oxidative stress, and we have central hormonal dysfunction. The word central means a dysfunction only within the brain and the central nervous system. So measuring hormones in your blood is not going to tell you anything about whether you have this dysfunction. And where these 4 broad categories overlap, this is where you have classic autism. But realistically, the same model applies to most types of autism. So now for a little bit more information on this Venn diagram. So the channelopathies, or differentially expressed genes, these can be inbuilt. In other words, you inherited them from parents, or they can be a random genetic cause, or they can be acquired. In other words, you weren't born with them, but they developed as a result of some environmental change. Neuroinflammation is complicated, but in general we can see that pro-inflammatory cytokines are elevated and anti-inflammatory cytokines are reduced, and we have this important ratio between NKCC1 and KCC2. These are chloride transporters. This is elevated. We have activated microglia. Microglia are the immune cells within the brain, and when they're activated it's called, when they're resting it's called M0. There's also an M1 and an M2 state. When the microglia are activated, they can't get on with the job they're supposed to be doing. One of those jobs is synaptic pruning, and one feature of autism is impaired synaptic pruning. They're also involved in myelination, general issues regarding neuroinflammation, inflammation, autoimmune disorders that are present in autism. This would be GI inflammation, mast cell activation, food allergy, asthma. And in the case of causes of autism, maternal immune activation is a known cause of autism, and it's also a model of autism. So if the mother during pregnancy has her immune system activated, that raises the chance that her child would have autism. Oxidative stress Oxidative stress is quite a fashionable term. For most people, middle-aged people, oxidative stress isn't present unless you have some kind of illness. Old people, it is present in the great majority of them, and people with autism, it's present. And oxidative stress is really a result of sort of chemical reactions going on inside your body not being completed correctly. So any kind of illness, disease, cancer for example, would tend to be associated with oxidative stress. Oxidative stress can also be caused by emotional stress. If you get very upset, during pregnancy, let's say you survive a hurricane or some emotional trauma, that emotional stress creates an oxidative stress which can be very damaging. Oxidative stress can cause mitochondrial dysfunction, and mitochondrial dysfunction can cause oxidative stress. And mitochondria, this is the part within the cells that generates the fuel, if you like. Central hormonal dysfunction, this is a complicated subject, and if you want to get into the highly complex understanding of autism, you end up looking at this hypoactive pro-growth signaling pathways. But that's a highly complex subject, but it very much involves hormones, particularly growth hormones. So these hormones are distorted in people with autism. They tend to have rapid brain growth initially, and then for the first 2 or 3 years. The brain grows too fast, doesn't grow quite as it should, tends to leave a large head. But the converse is also true, which is called microcephaly, when you have very small heads. Thyroid hormone does seem to be dysfunctional in some people with autism, and it's been suggested that the reason for that, it's not a shortage of the T4 pro-hormone. The problem is there's an enzyme that you need to have that converts this T4 hormone that circulates through your entire body, that converts it into the active hormone T3. That requires this enzyme called D2, and if you have oxidative stress, this reduces the amount of D2 you have. So this will leave someone who has oxidative stress not having enough thyroid hormone in their brain, and this will kind of slow them down, make them lethargic, and probably impede their cognitive development. And where all these different types of dysfunctions come together, this is classic autism. But you could equally well apply this schematic to something like Fragile X, or indeed most single gene autisms, because it might be a single gene that's dysfunctional in terms of DNA, but it then creates a whole cascade, and you might end up with 100 differentially expressed genes. And then you end up with the same kind of problems as you do with classic autism. So now we can transpose the elements of the polypill into these 4 broad categories. So in terms of channelopathies and differentially expressed genes, we've got bumetanide, azosamide, potassium bromide. What they're doing is reducing the level of chloride within neurons, and that is to correct this problem with NKCC1 and KCC2. These are chloride transporters that allow chloride to enter and exit neurons. And in much classic autism, you have too much chloride in neurons because neurons are permanently in the immature state that exists in the first couple of weeks of life. And then after a couple of weeks, when a baby is tiny, a change happens called the GABA switch, at which point the level of chloride is supposed to drop significantly within neurons. And this has an effect on how GABA, an important neurotransmitter, functions. The other elements in the sort of channelopathies, DEGs, verapamil is a calcium channel blocker and also a potassium channel blocker. Atorvastatin is a common statin drug that has effects on several autism genes in terms of their expression, DEGs, and it is broadly anti-inflammatory. Very low dose clonazepam, that has a very interesting effect on GABA A receptors that contain the alpha-2 or alpha-3 subunits. And by modulating how those particular GABA A receptors work, you make the GABA neurotransmitter more inhibitory. Clemastine is a common antihistamine, but also it affects P2X7 receptors. Neuroinflammation. So these are anti-inflammatory elements of the polypill. We've got clemastine, which is calming the microglia and also promoting myelination. Atorvastatin is also reducing the pro-inflammatory cytokines. Verapamil, it is playing a role, I think, principally with regard to mast cells. When mast cells are involved in allergic reactions. DMF, dimethyl fumarate, this I think is probably the most potent anti-inflammatory element. This is a drug that was developed a long time ago in Germany to treat psoriasis and recently started being used to treat multiple sclerosis. BHB, beta-hydroxybutyrate, this is a ketone, and this is the ketone that people on the ketogenic diet are trying to produce, and it's also what fuels young babies who are fed only on mother's milk, because mother's milk effectively is a ketogenic diet. Now, for the central hormonal dysfunction, there we have agmatine, which is increasing brain perfusion. So I think it's countering the lack of T3. DMF is increasing the amount of serotonin in the brain, and that's why it improves mood. Sulforaphane and broccoli, it's also having the same effect as DMF. In terms of treating oxidative stress, I'm using NAC, N-acetylcysteine. DMF is having the effect of turning on NRF2, which is this switch that turns on antioxidant genes. And NRF2 is also potentially activated by sulforaphane produced by eating broccoli. But it only works if you have enough of this enzyme myrosinase in your broccoli supplement. And I think most of them don't have this, or don't have enough of it. So going through the 4 parts of the Venn diagram in turn, let's start with channelopathies and DEGs. So we've got bumetanide and zosamide, which are very similar. They're blocking NKCC1, and because of this, they will gradually lower chloride within cells, within neurons. And this will take a couple of weeks before it may show an effect. This shifts GABA to inhibitory. GABA, this neurotransmitter, is stuck as excitatory in some people with autism, and this leads to cognitive dysfunction and potentially seizures. KBr, potassium bromide, this is reducing chloride simply by substituting bromide ions, which enter neurons more easily than chloride ions. And potassium bromide was the first epilepsy drug. It was widely used from 1850 onwards, and it still is used in Germany to treat Dravet syndrome and treatment-resistant epilepsy. Verapamil is the L-type calcium channel blocker, and these L-type channels, they are involved in mast cell degranulation, and this is kind of the allergy process, and in people with mast cell disorders it can be very helpful. Verapamil, well, L-type calcium channels are also very present in your pancreas, and incidentally this is one way of protecting someone who has diabetes, because in diabetes the beta cells that make insulin, this is all going on in your pancreas, and it's been shown that by blocking the L-type channels in beta cells you stop them from being destroyed, so you can prevent someone losing their ability to produce their own insulin, which is very interesting. So L-type channels, calcium channels, are everywhere, and they're in your brain, they're in your heart. It's normally the ones in your heart that doctors are treating. Verapamil also has an interesting effect on potassium channel Kv1.3, which is implicated in inflammation. So verapamil is a very interesting drug, and it even can be used to treat some kinds of irritable bowel syndrome, people with stomach problems. Atorvastatin, it regulates upregulates P10 and BCL2. These are cancer genes, but they're also autism genes. It also blocks Kv1.3, as verapamil does. Clemastine, it sensitizes P2X7 receptors, and this enhances myelination and it shifts microglia to their resting state. Both of those could be very relevant for someone with autism. And again, as I said before, this very low dose clonazepam, it's like 1/20th of the typical dose. It increases the inhibition, so it counters this excitation, EI imbalance that is found in most autism. But I should emphasize, only certain people respond to certain of these therapies. Just so happens the case I'm involved in, this is the regime, as it were. So now we move on again, and the next area we're going to look at is neuroinflammation. Now, there's been a vast amount of scientific evidence to show that neuroinflammation is present in those people who have autism, but very little has been done about it. In fact, almost nothing's been done about it. It's a complicated problem because inflammation is not simple. It's not in one dimension. You have a large number of different inflammatory and pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory agents, if you like. So it's highly complicated, and the kind of neuroinflammation in one person may be different to that in the other, and therefore require a different treatment. In the polypill that I've developed, the main elements include, well, BHB and DMF, and one of their targets is this receptor HCAR2. This is involved in microglial activation, but it has many other effects as well. The statin has broad anti-inflammatory effects, and this can be measured, has been measured in much research. One of the things it does is inhibits the activation of what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome. And what that then does is it reduces some of these dangerous inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1 beta, TNF alpha, and it also blocks Kv1.3. But nonetheless, atorvastatin is a very safe drug, and many millions of people are currently taking it because it also happens to reduce cholesterol. BHB from the ketogenic diet, it also inhibits activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome, and clemastine via the P2X7 receptors is shifting microglia to the resting state. So there's quite a lot going on in the polypill in terms of reducing neuroinflammation. Next, we'll be moving on to see oxidative stress. So in terms of treating oxidative stress, and there are two elements to that. There's reactive oxygen species and there's also reactive nitrogen species. The main element really is NAC, N-acetylcysteine, and this has been shown in a lot of research and clinical practice as an effective way of increasing the body's key antioxidant, which is GSH. So people with diabetes, people with severe asthma, they will all benefit from NAC. An alternative is to use a very similar type of antioxidant called alpha-lipoic acid, ALA. But NAC seems to work best for my case. Now, activating this redox switch NRF2, this is clearly a very important step in treating someone with oxidative stress. I think that DMF is much more potent in doing this than the broccoli sprout powder, but both are options. Coming back again to the Venn diagram, you can see that the remaining area is central hormonal dysfunction. This, I think, is the weakest area of the polypill because it's not possible at the moment to change hormones specifically in the brain without having an effect in the rest of the body. There is a very interesting research drug called DHED, and what that is, it's an oral pill you take that produces estradiol, but only in your brain. It has no effect on the levels elsewhere in your body. And this is very interesting because one of the key problems in autism is the expression of estrogen receptor beta, ER beta. And if you could affect that receptor, but only in the brain, that would be very likely to be beneficial. But that currently isn't possible. So in my polypill, I'm countering what I think is a likely lack of T3 by using agmatine. This increases endothelial nitric oxide synthase and then thus vasodilation, and so increases blood supply to the brain. And agmatine has been shown in trials to be effective in Alzheimer's, and in Alzheimer's, again, one of the problems is basically just a lack of energy going to within the brain, and agmatine has been shown to be effective. But agmatine in my son just makes him more energetic, both mentally and physically. I did look at an oral TRH superagonist some years ago, and this therapy in the US is being developed as a treatment, as an intranasal spray, funded by the US Army. But again, that's not practical really in today. DMF does have an effect on the level of serotonin and so mood, and that can be quite important for some people with autism. So there we are again, superimposing the elements of the polypill onto these four key areas where we have a problem in autism. So to sum up, you can see for each element of the polypill what its biological effect is and what its cognitive behavioural effect is. So for bumetanide, given at breakfast once a day, it's a diuretic, it's lowering intracellular chloride, been using it for 7 years, it raises IQ. It was commented at school that having been using it for a month, basically over the Christmas holidays, he was so much more joyful and he was present, and he was able to participate. Azotamide, used only for the last few months, this is doing exactly the same thing as bumetanide, but it has a different diuretic profile. Bumetanide makes you desperately want to go to pee, and given once a day before breakfast, that's fine, but a second daily dose really would be quite disruptive. Azosumide seems to be slightly milder in terms of effect on NKCC1, but the diuretic effect is much less. So we have a second daily dose of diuretic, but it's using azosumide. Potassium bromide, the German Dibro-B drug, it does work. It's been working over 150 years, so it should. We've been using it for 12 months, but it does have this side effect of very mild acne. The higher the dose of potassium bromide, the more acne you'll get. And this has been known for 150 years. It's a question of how severe is your problem. So if you have intractable seizures as a child, they may kill you, and therefore having a few spots isn't really a worry. Well, verapamil, it has a short half-life, so you need to take it 3 times a day, but at a small dose. We've been using it for 6 years. It resolved extreme anxiety that was resulting in self-injurious behaviour and aggression. This was particularly an issue in summer because allergies play a role in this process. Atorvastatin, which is this very common statin drug with anti-inflammatory effects, this improved cognition in really quite an interesting way. What we noticed was certain skills had been learned, but they were not being applied. So you have a situation where my son couldn't walk down the stairs in the morning. Leave his bedroom, he'd be stuck. He required someone to walk up the stairs and to bring him down. So he could walk down the stairs no problem, he just was in a way inhibited from doing so. And after 1 day of using atorvastatin, he got back this initiative so that he was able to apply skills that he already had. And this also applied to playing the piano, that he would never practice the piano unless someone sat next to him. After 1 day of atorvastatin, he would play by himself, unprompted. And also when you stop taking the statin, you lose these effects. It's quite interesting. N-acetylcysteine, NAC, this is a very common supplement. I've found that NAC Sustain, the sustained release version, is the best, in part because it hasn't oxidized by the time you get it, because NAC is a sort of reactive substance, and if you buy the one in gelatine capsules, it's already degraded by the time you receive it. This has been used for 6 years. It puts an end to stereotypy, or stimming, some people call it, and the associated anxiety. Well, clonazepam I've already mentioned in quite some detail. This is another way of raising cognitive function. It's a tiny dose, so it's extremely cheap, very safe. It works very well for some people, has no effect on others because they have a different issue with subunits of GABA A receptors. There's no way of predicting in advance, other than if you have Dravet syndrome, and in that syndrome it should help, because there's some research in mouse models to support that. The ketones, BHB and the C8 caprylic acid, also known as sort of MCT oil, this increased intelligent speech. So it didn't just increase verbalization, you actually got more thoughtful, rational speech. Now I think the same process, because it's affecting this channel HCA2, is also possible via DMF. Clemastine, which is the cheap antihistamine, this has been used for over a year, and it improves higher level cognitive function. So it seems to improve learning. In some people it's physical skills because it's a myelination issue, so they might learn to ride a bicycle. It might be quicker to learn the bicycle, or to learn to tie shoelaces, for example, where you have to learn this process. But in terms of cognitive function in my son, he started to express opinions, and that would be quite difficult to measure in some clinical trial, but it was very evident. Broccoli sprout powder, which is supposed to produce sulforaphane in the presence of this enzyme called myrosinase. We used this for 3 years. It does produce more speech, at least initially in the beginning. The effect did fade. Some people just counter this by increasing the dosage. But I think that DMF is actually a much better option. The DMF that I'm using is Fumaderm, which is a German treatment for psoriasis, and I'm using the smallest tablet produced and then splitting that into 6 doses, which are given in an enteric capsule, because DMF is a known irritant to your stomach, and if you don't take it with an enteric coating, you will get unpleasant side effects, and these side effects are completely resolved if you just put it in an enteric capsule. The effects are on NRF2 and HCA2, and the effects are really significant. The result has been more speech and, I would say, improved cognitive function. This may be because of the anti-inflammatory effect, changing this MKCC1, KCC2 balance. I have no means of knowing, but it's very effective from the first pill. That's what is interesting. Agmatine, we've been using this for more than 2 years, and this caused a big boost in mental and physical stamina, just like the Duracell or Energizer Bunny in the TV commercial. It's just alkaline batteries versus the old-fashioned batteries. The effect is unmissable, and I believe what is going on is the increase in endothelial nitric oxide synthase. This then leads to more nitric oxide, and that causes vasodilation and then more blood flow to the brain, so increased brain perfusion. The net effect of all these therapies is quite profound. In terms of cognition, it's sort of transformative, and it's allowed him to continue on to high school and actually function as a pretty much typical student, doing the regular assessments, coming in the middle of the class so academically, and compared to what things were like 8 years ago, when basically school, no learning took place. It was just somewhere to go to, not somewhere to get an education. And the effect on mood, he's happy all the time and very well integrated into his, well, amongst his peers.